Okay, y'all, stop everything you are doing right now and get into this craziness, because I have never, and I mean never, seen anything like this in my life. Not the biggest boss in the rap game allegedly getting outsold by a man who is literally sitting behind prison walls right now. Yes, you heard me right. A whole incarcerated man, with no interviews, no podcast run, no album rollout, no nothing, reportedly pulled bigger first-week numbers than Rick Ross. And the internet? Baby, the internet is being so loud about this. They're literally going around saying Rick Ross just dropped the first album in hip-hop history to have 0 listeners. 0. Now, just to be clear, that part is a joke, but the numbers underneath the joke? Those are very real. And y'all, they are bad. They are historically bad. We are talking about a man who has spent 20 years calling himself the biggest boss. A man with a mansion so big it practically has its own zip code. A man who went on every podcast that would have him talking about legacy, talking about charts, talking about Drake. And when the first week numbers finally came in, the whole rap game stopped what it was doing and started laughing. Tony Yayo is laughing. 50 Cent is laughing so hard he got on Instagram about it. DJ Akademiks is on stream saying the algorithm itself turned its back on this man. And Rick Ross is backstage on his own tour telling everybody the numbers do not even matter. Baby, we have to talk about all of it. So sit down and get your tea, because today we are getting into Rick Ross, Tony Yayo, 50 Cent, Tory Lanez, Drake, DJ Akademiks. Everybody is in the mix. Everybody is picking a side. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how one of the biggest names in hip-hop ended up becoming the biggest joke of the year. And y'all, the details are messier than anything you have heard so far. Let's get into it. So let's start with the numbers, because everything happening right now starts with the numbers. Rick Ross just released his brand new album, Set in Stone, and this was supposed to be a moment. This was album number 12 for Rick Ross. 20 years in the game. A whole anniversary tour happening at the exact same time. This was supposed to be the victory lap, y'all. The coronation. Instead, the projections came out, and Set in Stone is reportedly looking at somewhere around 17,000 units in its first week. Some outlets said 17.2K, some had it closer to 19. Rick Ross and his team are claiming a higher number once you count the physicals. And the album is being projected to debut somewhere around number 45 on the Billboard 200. Number 45, y'all, for Rick Ross. And then the streaming numbers dropped, and it got even worse, because reportedly Set in Stone pulled about 1.8 million streams on its opening day. Now I know 1.8 million sounds like a lot to regular people like me and you, but baby, in the streaming era, for an artist of that size, that is a whisper. To put it in perspective, folks were quick to point out that a single Drake song was pulling several times that in one day. One song was out streaming the entire Rick Ross album rollout by multiples. And the clip pages, the blogs, the group chats, everybody picked it up at the same time. And the conversation went from Rick Ross dropped an album to Rick Ross just flopped in less than 24 hours. And here's the part that really set the timeline on fire. Rick Ross did not go quiet into this release. He was everywhere. Interviews, podcasts, appearances. He was talking about Drake, talking about his own status, calling himself the biggest of all time, saying he plays the long game. One viral voice on the internet summed up what a lot of people were thinking. Who told Rick Ross it was a good idea to go missing from the front lines of music for years and then drop an album and jump straight on tour like nothing changed? Whoever told him that, baby, they do not love him. Because the game does not wait for anybody. Even Lil Wayne, when he came back after all that time tied up in the Birdman situation, had to rebuild the momentum piece by piece. The idea that you can disappear from the conversation and then just announce an album and expect the world to stop. Only a handful of artists alive can do that, and the internet is loudly debating whether Rick Ross is still one of them. And listen, the criticism was not just coming from random trolls. Commentators who actually like Rick Ross, people who call him one of their favorite rappers ever, were coming out saying the streaming numbers were shockingly low. When your own fans are the ones blinking at the screen, y'all, that is when you know the story is bigger than hate. Now, moving into the next layer of this mess, because this is where Tony Yayo enters the chat. And y'all know when Tony Yayo enters the chat, nothing stays calm. Tony Yayo looked at those first week numbers, looked at all the promotion Rick Ross did, And then he pulled out the comparison that nobody in Rick Ross's corner wanted to hear. Tory Lanez. Tory Lanez, who is literally incarcerated right now. Tory Lanez, who had no interview tour, no podcast circuit, no chance to stand on a single stage and promote his project, reportedly opened with around 19,700 units, edging out the numbers Rick Ross was being projected at. And Tony Yayo did not whisper it. He said it with his whole chest. He basically told Rick Ross he needs help, that he needs what he called the Drake stimulus package, and that the Drake stimulus package was not there for him this time. He said beefing with 50 Cent was not good for him. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, that nothing has been good for him lately, and that maybe it is time to find a new career. Y'all, a new career. For a man with 20 years of platinum plaques. That is not a critique, that is a public reading, and Tony Yayo knew exactly what he was doing. And Tony Yayo did not stop at the numbers, because Tony Yayo never stops at the numbers. He went straight for the image. He went back to the oldest wound in the Rick Ross story, the correctional officer past, the thing 50 Cent's camp has been throwing at Rick Ross for over a decade. Tony Yayo said he never understood how the culture even accepted it, how a man with that history got to walk around fronting like the biggest street boss who ever lived. He refuses to even call him Rick Ross. He calls him Ricky Roseby every single time. Like the name itself is a joke he refuses to let die. And then he dropped the line that the whole internet ran with. He said some rich people are like, and I am going to clean this up for y'all. Something ugly with glitter sprinkled on top. Looks good, shines bright. But when you get close, it is still exactly what it always was. He said money does not uncorny people. And y'all, whatever you think about Tony Yayo, that glitter line was engineered to travel, and it traveled. It was clipped, quoted, reposted, and stitched within hours, because it gave everybody who already had doubts about Rick Ross a perfect little package to put those doubts in. Now just to be clear, because I always want to be fair on this channel, comparing Rick Ross and Tory Lanez is not a clean comparison. Tory Lanez has a completely different audience, a completely different release situation, and honestly, there is a portion of his support that shows up specifically because of his circumstances, not in spite of them. Sales depend on streaming habits, timing, fan loyalty, playlist placement, competition, and 100 other things. But here's the thing, y'all. Tony Yayo was never trying to make a fair argument. He was making an effective one. If a man who cannot leave a cell can outsell you while you are doing wall-to-wall press, the question writes itself. What was all that visibility actually worth? And because of the history between Rick Ross and G-Unit, because of the years and years of tension with 50 Cent, Tony Yayo's little math lesson never felt like sales analysis. It felt like what it was, a shot. A calculated, well-aimed shot at a rival who was already wobbling. And y'all, Tony Yayo even dragged gunplay into it. He brought up that old Maybach chain situation, joking about how the chain toured Brooklyn and Queens on what he called a greasy neck tour. And then he pointed out that Gunplay himself is out here now saying he is a G-Unit fan, a 50 Cent fan. Tony Yayo basically invited Gunplay to come sit with them, joking that they would even give him some bread for the interview, because Rick Ross is not exactly taking care of him. Now, whether you think that is funny or foul, look at what it does strategically. It is not just numbers anymore. It is loyalty. It is the suggestion that the empire Rick Ross built is quietly losing its own soldiers. First the sales wobble, then the comparisons start, then people from your own extended circle start smiling at the other side of the fence. That is how a narrative avalanche starts, y'all. One pebble at a time. And can we talk about how confusing the numbers game got? Because for about 72 hours, nobody on the internet could even agree on what Rick Ross actually sold. First there was a projection. Then there was a lower projection. Then 50 Cent got on Instagram throwing around a 2,000 figure like it was carved on a stone tablet. Then Rick Ross's side came out saying hold on. The 17K floating around does not include physical copies, and the real streaming report is on the way. Then another number surfaced, 19,000, and the blogs ran with that too. Y'all, there were at least 4 different versions of the truth trending at the same time, and every fan base picked the one that matched how they already felt. If you ride for Rick Ross, you were sharing the 22,000 first week, 20,000 second week version with the no fall off caption. If you ride for 50 Cent, you were posting LOL and that tiny little number with the coffin emojis. And that right there is the modern music business in one picture. The data does not even have to settle before the narrative does. The story wins first. The math catches up later, if anybody is still watching by then. Meanwhile, Rick Ross was literally on tour while all of this was unfolding, which added a whole second battlefield to the conversation. Because now it was not just album math. People started pulling up clips and posts about ticket sales, about venues, about how full the rooms looked. And y'all know how the internet does. One person posts a half-empty section with a caption, and suddenly it is the official story of the entire tour. On the other side, Rick Ross's camp was pushing back, talking about tens of thousands of tickets moved across multiple cities, framing the whole thing as a victory lap for a 20-year career. So once again, you had two movies playing at the same time on the same screen. In one movie, Rick Ross is a legend celebrating 20 years with sold-out love. In the other movie, Rick Ross is a man watching empty chairs while Tony Yayo reads first-week numbers out loud like a eulogy. And the truth, as usual, is probably sitting somewhere in the middle, refusing to trend. What is not in the middle is the timing, y'all. Dropping the softest first week of your career in the exact same window as your anniversary tour was either incredible confidence or a catastrophic scheduling accident, and the internet has already voted on which one they believe. But moving into the part of this story that everybody is really here for, the Drake of it all. Because you cannot talk about Set in Stone without talking about the Cold War that was hanging over the entire rollout. For months leading up to this album, Rick Ross had been publicly criticizing Drake, his music, his output, his place in the game. And in interview after interview, people kept asking Rick Ross about it directly. They asked him if the beef was being put to rest, and Rick Ross gave that smooth, slippery answer he loves to give, talking about how Set in Stone is all about etching a little bit at a time. They asked him if he puts Drake on his level, and y'all, Rick Ross said of course not. He called Drake a minion. A minion. On camera. Now, say what you want about Rick Ross. The man does not do small quotes. But here is the problem with calling one of the most streamed artists in human history a minion while your own album is on the runway. When your numbers land soft, that quote stops being confidence and starts being evidence. And the internet went and collected every single one of those clips like receipts at a trial. And what makes the Drake angle cut even deeper is the history of the collaboration itself. For years, Rick Ross and Drake together was practically a guaranteed event. Their records were moments. So when this album arrived with no Drake on it, after months of Rick Ross publicly aiming at him, fans immediately started doing the math out loud. Some of them said Rick Ross has classic albums that Drake was never on, that he built his name before that partnership ever existed, and that is true. But even the people defending him had to admit the obvious out loud. A Drake feature, in this climate, against this much noise, would have changed the temperature of the entire release. One commentator said it in the most internet way possible. My boy Ricky is going to have to go squash his issues with Drake if he wants to climb back up them charts. But the sad part is, Drake probably does not even want to do that anymore. And whether that is fair or not, that is the conversation Rick Ross's own rollout created. He spent months making Drake the headline, and when the album came out, Drake was still the headline. The man was not even on the project, and somehow he was the most discussed feature on it. That, y'all, is what it looks like when the controversy becomes bigger than the music it was supposed to promote. Now, y'all knew this was coming. You cannot have a Rick Ross stumble without the man himself showing up to dance on the wobble. 50 Cent Curtis Jackson. The moment those first week numbers hit the blogs, 50 Cent got on Instagram and did what 50 Cent does better than anybody in the history of this culture. He turned somebody else's bad week into his own personal holiday. He posted about Rick Ross's numbers, laughing, saying he just saw the record sales, and it is over. He joked about the figures being so low they barely registered, tossing around that 2,000 number like confetti. And if you know anything about the history here, you know this was never going to be a one-post situation. 50 Cent and Rick Ross have been at war for the better part of 2 decades. This beef has outlived record labels, trends, entire eras of hip-hop. 50 Cent has literally said in interviews that when Rick Ross mentions him, he does not ignore it. He destroys him, his words, and builds what he called a portfolio of trophies to warn other artists what happens when you compete before you are ready. So a Rick Ross flop, to 50 Cent, is not news. It is a gift. It is Christmas in the middle of the year. And the timing made it even sweeter for him, because Rick Ross had been poking at 50 Cent for weeks before the album even dropped. Rick Ross was out there talking about how 50 Cent does not own his masters, saying Eminem saved him, saying Dr. Dre saved him, saying all the big names carried him while Rosary did it himself. Rick Ross even joked about those G-Unit sneakers, saying they were headed straight to Costco, saying he liked the Lloyd Banks pair better than 50 Cent's own pair, telling 50 Cent to give Lloyd Banks his own high top. And when 50 Cent teased that he had music coming with Eminem, and jokingly threw Tupac's name in there, Rick Ross clowned that too, telling him Pac has been gone for decades, let that man rest, telling Curtis to put the shoes out, let them flop, and go do a little remix with Tony Yayo and Lloyd Banks. So when the Set in Stone numbers came back soft, 50 Cent did not have to invent anything. He just had to hold up the mirror. He joked about Rick Ross cutting his own grass at that big mansion, asking why a boss is out there mowing his own lawn, asking if the air conditioning is broken, if the lawsuit money ran out. Petty? Absolutely. Surgical? Also yes. Because every single joke was built on one theme: the gap between the image Rick Ross sells and the reality the numbers were telling. But Rick Ross was not about to sit there and take it quietly, and this is where it goes from chart talk to full-blown war again. Rick Ross fired back at 50 Cent, and he aimed at the thing 50 Cent is building his entire second act around: that film studio situation out in Shreveport, Louisiana. Rick Ross started asking questions, publicly, loudly. How is it going over there in Shreveport? You borrowed all those people's money. Did you return it? He said Hollywood does not need another film studio. Louisiana does not need it. And he straight up told 50 Cent to give people their money back. Now, just to be clear, those claims from Rick Ross have been disputed, and 50 Cent's side has its own version of that whole situation. So take all of that as what it is: two rivals throwing everything at the wall. But look at how fast the conversation moved. In 1 week, we went from album sales, to sneakers, to masters, to film studios, to who owes who money. That is what this beef does. It swallows every topic it touches. And Rick Ross did not stop there. He came back with the loyalty angle, saying 50 Cent should be loyal to the people who gave him his television opportunities the way he is loyal to Eminem, bringing up the money per episode talk, saying the woman who created those shows gave 50 Cent his shot. He even said he wanted to go viral that morning. And baby, he got his wish, just maybe not the way he planned. Because while Rick Ross was swinging at 50 Cent, the internet was still staring at those first week numbers, and every punch he threw at Curtis kept the whole story trending longer. Now let's get into the angle that has the whole culture arguing in circles, because DJ Akademiks looked at this situation and said something that split the timeline right down the middle. Akademiks said the algorithm is against Rick Ross. Yes, y'all. Not the fans, not the music, the algorithm. His argument is that when Rick Ross turned on Drake, a huge chunk of listeners who lived in that shared fan space, people who ride for Drake and used to ride for Rick Ross too, quietly walked away. And in the streaming era, when the casual listeners do not show up in week 1, the platforms stop pushing you, the playlists cool off, the recommendations dry up, and the snowball rolls downhill. Now, Akademiks was pressed on this live, because it sounds wild at first. People were literally stopping him mid-sentence like, wait, are you really saying the algorithm itself is beefing with Rick Ross? And he stood on it. He said it is real, that everything Rick Ross was talking about during the rollout was not geared toward the project the way it should have been. That people were tuning into Rick Ross interviews to hear what he would say about Drake, not what he would say about Set in Stone. And when the clips went viral, it was the Drake talk that traveled, not the music. Think about that, y'all. The controversy ate the rollout alive. But here is where I need everybody to be honest, because there is another side to this, and the other side has receipts too. Plenty of voices came out saying this algorithm talk is maximum copium. Their words, not mine. They said if this was Drake catching a flop, the same people crying about algorithms would be dancing on the numbers, calling him washed, saying Kendrick ended him, popping bottles over every bad projection. One commentator said it plain: everybody wants an excuse for Rick Ross. It is the algorithm, it is the timing, it is the rollout, it is the fans, it is everything except the possibility that the music just did not move people this time. And listen, there is truth on both sides. There is no public evidence that any platform deliberately suppressed Rick Ross or targeted his album. None. That part is speculation, and I am not going to sit here and sell y'all speculation as fact. But it is also true that feuds have a cost. When you spend months publicly criticizing one of the biggest artists on the planet, you are gambling with the shared audience between you. Some people who used to press play on Rick Ross out of habit may have simply not pressed play this time. Not out of conspiracy, out of choice. And in a numbers game, y'all, choice is the only vote that counts. And through all of this, Rick Ross himself has been moving like a man who refuses to let the scoreboard tell his story. While the internet was clowning the first week, Rick Ross got on camera backstage at his own anniversary tour and addressed it head-on. He told his Day One supporters that none of this happens without them. He said Set in Stone is one of his best bodies of work, something he stands on. He said the 17K number everybody was running with was not the full picture, that his streaming numbers plus physicals told a different story. His camp put out a streaming report claiming tens of millions of streams across the first 2 weeks, which they say works out to 22,000 the first week and 20,000 the second, which in his words means there was no fall off at all. And then Rick Ross said the part that really got people talking. He said the new flex is no bots. Keep it genuine. Keep it pure. Let the music fight the battles. He said when other artists show those drastic second-week collapses, that is when you know the numbers were inflated. Basically, y'all, Rick Ross stood in the middle of the worst first-week discourse of his career and accused everybody above him on the charts of being fake. He compared himself to Basquiat, said when Basquiat painted a work of art he never knew what it was worth, and told young hustlers not to ever let a first week make or break them. He said 20 years ago the other guy was doing $1 million in a week while he was doing 150,000, and 20 years later, here he still is. Now, whether you hear that as wisdom or as damage control probably depends on which side of this you were already on. His supporters heard a veteran preaching patience. His critics heard a man moving the goalposts after spending months talking big. And that divide, y'all, is the entire story in miniature. Now here is where the debate got genuinely interesting, because once the jokes settled down, the culture started arguing about the actual question underneath all of this. Does visibility even mean anything anymore? Think about it, y'all. Rick Ross did everything the old playbook says to do. He stayed visible. He did the interviews. He made the appearances. He kept his name in the conversation every single week. Tony Yayo even joked about it from the other side, asking who is more relevant right now, Rick Ross with his record sales or other names from that era who stay trending off rants alone. It was a joke, but it was also a real question dressed up as one. Because what the first week of Set in Stone might be telling us is that attention and demand are not the same thing anymore. People will watch you talk. People will clip you, quote you, argue about you, meme you. And then when it is time to press play, a whole lot of those same people just keep scrolling. Watching is free, y'all. Listening is a decision. And the gap between those two things is exactly where this album fell through the floor. And on the other side of that argument, the defenders of Rick Ross were not quiet either. Their case goes like this. This is a man 20 years deep, with businesses, with a car show, with licensing money, with a catalog that pays him while he sleeps. He is not a new artist whose life depends on a first week. He diversifies, he books shows, he tours, and the album is almost a business card at this point. Proof that the brand is still active. And honestly, y'all, there is real logic in that. Plenty of veteran artists would trade their whole discography for 1 week of the problems Rick Ross is having right now. But, and this is the part his defenders do not love, you cannot spend the entire rollout talking like the charts are your personal property and then, when the charts disagree, suddenly announce that charts were never the point. That switch is exactly what his critics grabbed onto. The same voices who were calling him the biggest of all time in May were calling first week numbers a young man's game by June. And in hip-hop, y'all, the timeline never forgets. The timeline keeps screenshots. The timeline is petty, organized, and undefeated. There was even a whole side conversation about whether this is just what the pick-a-side era does to people. Once Rick Ross stood on the opposite side of the Drake divide, everything he does now gets graded against that choice. If he wins, the other side goes quiet for a day. If he stumbles, and this week, he stumbled, it becomes a parade. And the saddest part for the music itself is that Set in Stone barely got to be an album. From the day it dropped, it was a talking point, a punchline, a scoreboard, a weapon in 3 different beefs at once. Some listeners who actually sat with the project said there were real records on there, moments that deserved better than being buried under a meme cycle. But that is the tax on loud rollouts, y'all. When you market the noise is what shows up on release day. And sometimes it shows up wearing your album like a costume. And y'all, that divide spilled over into one of the pettiest sub-arguments of the whole week, the legend debate. Because once those numbers started circulating, people were not just arguing about an album anymore. They were arguing about what Rick Ross is, period. One clip that made the rounds said it as cold as it could possibly be said. If you have been in this game 15, 20 years, and you cannot move 100,000 units, maybe the legend title needs to be reevaluated. And phew, the comments under that one were a battlefield. On one side, you had people saying longevity is the legend, that surviving 20 years in a business this cruel is the achievement, that nobody remembers first week numbers, but everybody remembers the records. On the other side, you had people saying a boss is supposed to move like a boss, and that you cannot wear the crown in every interview, and then plead context every time the scoreboard shows up. Both sides had points, both sides had agendas, and neither side was really listening to the other, which, if we are being honest, is the official sport of hip-hop Twitter in 2026. And then Rick Ross did something that I have to give him credit for. Whether you love him or cannot stand him, the man did not hide. While everybody was tallying up his flop like accountants at a funeral, Rick Ross was on his story asking the fans playful questions, offering up the whole boss fantasy experience. The bottles, the vinyl, the autographed CD, the one-on-one conversation with the big boss himself. He called Set in Stone the album of the year with a straight face while the charts were saying number 45. He told everybody that whatever his final numbers end up being, he is going to throw a party for them. A party, y'all, for the numbers. Now, his critics heard that and said it was the corniest damage control they had ever seen, that nobody throws a party for projections unless the projections need a party. But his supporters heard something else. They heard a man who has been counted out before, who watched other artists from his era come and go, refusing to let a bad week write his obituary. And that right there might be the most genuinely Rick Ross thing about this entire saga. The confidence does not waver, even when it probably should. Even Tony Yayo admitted, in the middle of clowning him, that the man has jokes and knows how to talk. When your enemies are complimenting your charisma while they bury you, baby, you are not a regular artist. You are a whole character in the culture. But let me be real with y'all about the double standard sitting in the middle of all this, because it is too big to ignore. Multiple commentators pointed out that when certain other artists have a slow week, the conversation gets wrapped in context immediately. He has other ventures, he is diversifying, the album will grow, look at the tour. And to be fair, all of that is being said about Rick Ross too, and some of it is legitimate. But the people making the copium argument were asking a sharper question. Why does the grace only flow in one direction? If the roles were reversed, if it was one of Rick Ross's rivals posting 1.8 million opening day streams, would the timeline be this thoughtful, this nuanced, this patient? Or would it be a cookout? Y'all already know the answer to that. And that is maybe the most revealing thing about this whole story. Not the numbers themselves, but watching the entire culture negotiate, in real time, about who is allowed to flop gracefully and who gets clowned into the next dimension. Rick Ross, to his credit and his detriment, got a little bit of both. And can we talk about the rollout itself for a second? Because some of the sharpest criticism was not even about beef, it was about strategy. People who actually cover this business were pointing out that Set in Stone came with no proper single rollout, no clear moment record, no song that was already living in the streets before the album landed. Rick Ross pushed the album back at one point, which gave people even more time to speculate. And there was one absence everybody noticed immediately, no Drake. For years, that collaboration was the cheat code. Their records together were events. This time, not only was there no Drake record, there was an entire public Cold War with Drake hanging over the release. One commentator joked that Rick Ross was trying to jump ahead of a flop, saying he had never seen anything like it. And when Rick Ross said on a podcast that he is already paid before the album even comes out, that he has been selling records for 20 years while other people are doing little deals, folks in the industry clapped back with a fair question. If whoever is paying you upfront watches you miss even a fraction of expectations, why would they ever do that deal again? Being rich and flopping are not opposites, y'all. You can be rich and flop at the same time. Money does not uncorny a flop, to borrow the spirit of what Tony Yayo said. Now, to be fair to Rick Ross, and y'all know I try to keep it balanced even when the tea is hot, the reaction was not 100% negative. A lot of listeners said the actual music on Set in Stone was strong, and the collaboration with YFN Lucci in particular got real praise as one of the standout moments of the project. The bigger criticism was never that Rick Ross had nothing worth hearing. It was that after such a loud, visible, chest-out build-up, the album simply did not create the commercial earthquake people were promised. And that is the trap of big talk, y'all. When you spend months telling everybody you are the biggest, the boss, the standard, the numbers do not just get judged as numbers. They get judged as a verdict on everything you said. Every interview, every confident quote, every shot at Drake, every joke about 50-cent sneakers, all of it ended up on the same scoreboard. That is the risk you take when the rollout is built on noise. When the numbers arrive, people do not just listen to the music. They grade the talk. So where does this leave Rick Ross now? Honestly, y'all, that depends on what happens next, and there are a few real possibilities. First week numbers are one snapshot, not a whole career. Albums can grow. Songs can catch fire months later. One sync, one TikTok moment, one tour performance that goes viral, and suddenly the whole narrative flips. Rick Ross has a catalog that still gets played every single day, businesses outside of music, a car show, properties, and 20 years of relationships in this industry. He is going to get bookings off this. He is going to tour off this. By every normal measure, the man is going to be fine. But the question the culture is really asking is not whether Rick Ross will be okay. It is whether the boss image survives a week like this unchanged. Because the image was always the product as much as the music was. And now you have Tony Yayo using Tory Lanez as a measuring stick, 50 Cent turning the sales into a running joke, Akademiks floating the algorithm theory, the fans fighting over whether the Drake feud cost him half his audience, and Rick Ross standing in the middle of it all talking about Basquiat and bots. What started as an album release has turned into a referendum on 20 years of branding, beef, and big talk. And the wildest part? Every single person involved benefits from keeping the fight going. The clips get views. The streams get argued over. The beef stays warm. In this economy of attention, y'all, even a flop can be monetized, as long as everybody keeps talking about it. And baby, they are definitely still talking. All right, y'all, now I need to hear from you, because the comments on this one are about to be a war zone. Do you think the Drake situation actually hurt Rick Ross's numbers? Or are people connecting two things that have nothing to do with each other? Was Tony Yayo making a fair point with that Tory Lanez comparison? Or was it just a well-aimed troll from a man with 20 years of beef behind him? And 50 Cent, was he making a real point about the music business? Or was he just doing what he always does, dancing on his rival's bad week? And be honest, did you actually listen to Set in Stone? If you did, tell me your honest rating, no groupthink. Drop it all in the comments, because I read every single one. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like it, share it with somebody who has been arguing about this all week, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss the tea. And do not go nowhere, because there is another story on your screen right now with even more hip-hop drama that you are not going to believe. Click that video, come back, and tell me what you think, and I will talk to y'all later. Bye now.